It was a cold, rainy afternoon when James Monroe, a successful businessman and millionaire, received an unexpected call that would forever change the course of his life. The man on the other side of the phone had an urgent message for him, one that sent shivers down his spine. James, who had built his wealth through sheer determination and years of hard work, never imagined that the story of a little girl in an orphanage would have anything to do with him. But what he didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary phone call was about to unravel a mystery that had been hidden for years. As James sat in his office, staring out the window at the heavy downpour, the caller explained that an orphan girl named Emily had been found holding his photo in the orphanage. At first, James thought it was a mistake. Why would an orphan girl have his photo? What was the connection? The caller spoke of a tattered photograph, faded with age, that Emily clutched in her tiny hands as if it was the most precious thing in the world. The image showed James as a young man, decades ago, in a time when he was just starting his journey, before the wealth, before the fame, and long before he even considered the idea of children. The question that haunted James was simple. How could this little girl, who had never met him, be holding a photograph of him from his past? Was it mere coincidence, or was there something deeper, something more personal, at play? Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, James decided to visit the orphanage himself. Little did he know, this visit would open doors to a past he thought he had buried forever. As James walked through the cold, dimly lit halls of the orphanage, his thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's small hands gripping his photo with such intensity. The orphanage was far from luxurious, the paint peeling off the walls and the air heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. He had always been focused on his career, his wealth, and his ambitions, but now, standing in this place, he felt something he hadn't in years: guilt. The orphanage was quiet when he arrived, most of the children going about their daily routines, but when he was finally led to Emily's room, the sight that greeted him took his breath away. The little girl was sitting by the window, staring out into the rain with the photograph still in her hand. Her eyes were wide and filled with a sadness that James couldn't quite understand. She looked so much like someone he once knew. The resemblance was uncanny. But how could that be? He had never seen her before. Emily looked up as James entered, her gaze locking onto his for the briefest of moments. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. She didn't say anything at first, but simply held the photograph out to him. With trembling hands, James took the photo, his heart racing in his chest. As he examined it closely, memories flooded back, memories he had long tried to forget. This was a photograph from his youth, taken at a time when he had no ties to the world of orphans, no responsibilities beyond his own ambitions. But here it was, in the hands of a girl who seemed to know him, even though he had never met her. James' mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Who was Emily really? And why did she have this photograph? The answers eluded him. But one thing was certain, there was a connection between them. A bond he couldn't explain. Could she be someone from his past? Or perhaps, a reminder of a chapter of his life he had buried so deep that even he had forgotten. As the moments passed, James found himself becoming more and more intrigued by Emily. She wasn't just an orphan with an old photograph. There was something about her that felt familiar, something that drew him in. Was it her eyes? The way she held herself, so quiet and reserved? Or was it the unspoken history that seemed to hang between them, one that neither of them was ready to confront? The more he looked at her, the more questions he had. Was she truly just a random child, holding onto a faded picture for no particular reason? Or was this a sign of something greater, something that James had been unaware of until now? The mystery deepened with every passing second. The caretaker who had been with James as he entered the orphanage spoke softly, as if afraid to interrupt the growing tension in the room. Emily's story. It's not just about the photo. There's more to it than that. She's been asking about you for months, even though she doesn't know who you are. She doesn't remember where she got the photo, but every night she looks at it like it's a piece of her past. And she always says the same thing: "Hell come for me. He has too." James' heart skipped a beat. Come for her? What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But before the caretaker could answer, Emily stood up abruptly, her eyes locked onto James once more. She didn't speak, but there was something in her expression that spoke volumes. She knew something he didn't. She had the answers, but she wasn't ready to give them up just yet. James was left standing there, holding the photograph, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. Who was this little girl? And what was the connection between them? How had she come to possess such an important piece of his past? And most importantly, what did it all mean for his future? The answers were out there, but they were just beyond his reach. And as he looked into Emily's eyes, he realized one thing. The search for the truth had only just begun. James stood frozen in the room, the weight of the photograph in his hand heavy, almost suffocating. The silence between him and Emily was deafening, each moment stretching longer than the last. Her small, fragile form stood before him, her eyes never leaving his, as if she was waiting for something, waiting for him to say or do something that would make sense of it all. But the longer he stared at her, the more he realized that there were no easy answers here. He tried to steady his breath. "Emily, where did you get this photo?" he asked gently, his voice trembling slightly, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, and for the first time since they'd met, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her face. "I don't know," she whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear, "but I know I'm supposed to find you. You're the one in the picture, and you're the one who will save me." Her words sent a chill through James. Save her? He wasn't sure what she meant, but the look in her eyes was so sincere, so filled with a desperate hope, that it made his heart ache. She was a child, just a little girl, and yet she spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived through things far beyond her years. James felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on building his wealth, his empire, that he had forgotten about the people in need, the ones who were invisible in his world. But this was different. There was something about Emily that struck him deeply. He couldn't walk away, not now. He had to know what this was all about. "Save you from what?" he asked, crouching down to her level, trying to look into her eyes for any clue, any hint of what she was talking about. But before Emily could respond, the door to the room creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with soft, kind eyes and a motherly demeanor. She was the caretaker James had met earlier, and she looked at him with an expression that suggested she had been watching this interaction with quiet concern. "James," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of urgency. "There's something you need to understand about Emily. She hasn't just been asking about you. She's been saying your name for years, even when she was just a baby. And for as long as she's been here, she's clung to that photo like it's the only thing she has left. We thought it was just a phase, but it's not." James was confused. He had no idea what she meant. "What do you mean, she's been saying my name?" he asked, the confusion in his voice growing. The caretaker sighed, her expression shifting to something more solemn. "Emily came to us when she was only a few months old. She had no family, no background, no history. Just a small child, with nothing but a blanket and that photo. She didn't speak for months, not a word. But then, one day, she started saying your name. At first, we thought it was just a coincidence. But then she started drawing pictures of you, of a man who looked just like you, from what we could tell, even though she had never seen you. And she always said the same thing. He's the one. He'll come for me." James felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This was starting to feel like more than just a strange coincidence. There was something deeper at play here, something tied to his past, something he couldn't yet understand. His mind raced back to his own childhood, to the years before he became a successful businessman. But he couldn't think of anything that would explain this. "Why is she so convinced I'm the one who can help her?" James asked, his voice tight with tension. The caretaker's face grew darker, her eyes flickering with a mix of sorrow and fear, because of what happened to her mother. James furrowed his brow. "Her mother?" The caretaker nodded slowly. Emily's mother wasn't just an orphan like the others. She came from a wealthy family, a powerful one. But she was also running from something dangerous. We don't know much about her, but we do know she had a connection to someone who could have changed Emily's life. That's where you come in, James. James' heart raced. What are you talking about? I don't understand. The caretaker stepped closer, lowering her voice. Emily's mother was your sister. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James recoiled, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His sister. But he had no sister. His parents had never spoken of a sister, and he had never had any memory of a sibling. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The caretaker must have seen the shock on his face, because she continued, "It's true. Your sister was adopted when she was young, and she was raised far from here. But she never stopped searching for you. She never stopped trying to reach you. And before she died, she left a message for Emily. She said that one day you would come to save her, that you were the only one who could help her." James felt as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. How could this be possible? How could he have a sister he had never known about, a sister who had left behind a child with his photo? The story seemed like something out of a dream, a twisted reality he wasn't ready to accept. Emily looked at him, her small face filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his, her grip surprisingly strong for a girl so young. "You are my family," she whispered. "You have to help me. You're the only one who can." James felt his heart pound in his chest, his mind racing as the weight of the truth began to settle over him. His past, the life he had carefully built, was being pulled apart. The life he knew had just collided with a new reality, one that he was not ready to face. But as Emily's eyes locked onto his, filled with hope and desperation, he knew there was no turning back. The journey to uncover the truth was just beginning, and the answers, he realized, were more tangled than he ever imagined. James stood there, his mind spinning as Emily's words echoed in his ears. "You are my family," she had said, her voice filled with an emotion so raw it cut through him like a knife. His heart was racing, and a strange sense of urgency began to grow within him. The mystery surrounding Emily, the photograph, and the claim that she was his niece had taken a grip on him that he couldn't ignore. With every passing second, it felt as if the pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden for years were beginning to fall into place. He knew he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't leave Emily in the dark any longer. If there was even a sliver of truth to what the caretaker had told him, if he really had a sister and a niece he never knew about, he had to find out more. For once, his business empire, the wealth, the success, it didn't matter. What mattered now was family. "Where is she? Where is my sister?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The caretaker hesitated for a moment, her eyes clouded with sorrow. She motioned for him to follow her, leading him down a narrow corridor in the orphanage. At the end of the hall, there was a door marked "Private." She opened it slowly, revealing a small, cluttered office filled with papers and old files. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights above them. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "Your sister, her name was Claire. She came here seeking help, trying to escape from a dangerous man. She told us everything before she passed away. She had no one else to turn to." James felt a pang in his chest as he heard the name Claire. He had never known. He had never even suspected that someone in his family had suffered in silence. Claire's life had been a mystery, one that had slipped away without a trace. But Emily, his niece, was the last piece of that story. The caretaker pulled out a worn file from one of the drawers and handed it to James. "This is everything we know about her, and about Emily." James sat down at the desk, his hands shaking as he opened the file. Inside, there were photographs of Claire as a young woman, and then later, pictures of Emily as a baby. There were also letters, old notes, and documents detailing Claire's search for James. It was all there, her attempts to contact him, to find him, and her desperate hope that one day, James would step in to protect her daughter. As he read through the papers, a sense of overwhelming sadness washed over him. He realized that his sister had been carrying the burden of a dark past, one that he had never known about. She had tried to reach him, tried to give her daughter a better life, but somewhere along the way, something had gone terribly wrong. And now, Emily was here, holding onto that same hope. James stood up suddenly, the weight of the moment hitting him with full force. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking as he turned to Emily. "I didn't know. But I'm here now. I'm going to make sure nothing happens to you." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes full of trust. She didn't speak, but her hand reached out to him, as if to say, "I knew you'd come." The door to the room creaked open again, and this time, the figure who entered was not a familiar face. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a cold smile that made James' blood run cold. He was the last person James had ever expected to see. The man who had been terrorizing Claire all those years. The man who had driven her to seek refuge here. The man's eyes locked onto James, and in that instant, everything changed. He had known that Emily was important, that the girl with the photograph was the key. But now, standing before James, the truth became clear. The past had never truly stayed buried, and neither had the danger. James' mind raced. He couldn't let this man get to Emily, not now, not after everything that had happened. But the man was closing in, stepping toward Emily with a dangerous glint in his eye. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to finish what he had started years ago. Without thinking, James rushed forward, blocking the man's path. "Stay away from her," he said, his voice firm, the fire of protection burning within him. The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You don't understand, do you? She's not your responsibility. She's just a girl, and I'm here to take what's mine." But James wasn't backing down. In that moment, the truth of his family, his past, and his responsibility to protect Emily came rushing forward. His wealth, his success, they meant nothing compared to this. He had to fight for her. He had to fight for the family he had never known he had. With a surge of adrenaline, James pushed the man away, shouting for help. The caretaker ran in, followed by some of the other workers from the orphanage. The man hesitated, his eyes flashing with anger before he turned and fled into the night. James stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had protected Emily, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. His life would never be the same. He had a family now, people who needed him, people he couldn't ignore anymore. As the chaos settled, James knelt down beside Emily, who had been watching the entire confrontation with wide eyes. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and wrapped her small arms around him, holding him tightly. James felt a lump in his throat as he embraced her. He had never imagined that he would be here, at this point, protecting a niece he had never known. But as he held her, he realized that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who needed you, who you were meant to protect, no matter the cost. As they stood there in the quiet of the orphanage, James knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer alone. He had a purpose now, a reason to fight for something greater than himself. And as for Emily, she had found the family she had been waiting for. And James, too, had finally found what he never knew he needed. The search for the truth had led him to something far more precious than anything money could buy: love, redemption, and the promise of a future together.